In this video, I'm going to show you exactly over 50 ways to find a motivated seller anywhere in the country. Disclaimer, this may or may not be applicable to your market. Rules are always changing, regulations are always changing, so make sure you stay on top of that front. Now, let's jump right into number one. And with this list, since it's so long, I'm just going to call them out. I'm going to run through them. I believe Jerry did something like this years and years ago. And so when I was thinking about this, it was almost inspired by Jerry. Starting with number one, eviction notices. Out of state landlords, landowners who own more than one property with back taxes, property owners where tax assessment went way up, property owned by people that went out of business, tax delinquent homeowners, it's a very good list, unemployment office. You go out there, you hand out flyers, business cards, etc. Post flyers in large stores like Home Depot. I've personally done this one. Vacant landowners in areas that are getting developed. So you see a lot of buildings going up, and you see some vacant land. It's a great opportunity to go in there and snatch up some land and wholesale it to developers. You have the OG Craigslist. You have eBay. I've seen some crazy things on eBay. You have the Let Go app. You have low income zip codes. Be careful with that one. You have people getting divorced. That one is good and also can be a little tricky, a lot of emotions. You have divorce attorneys. You have FSBOs or for sale by owner. FSBO, for sale by owner. You have expired MLS listings. It's a great niche. Kevin Cho, and there's a handful. He's the first that came to mind. He does a lot of subject twos on low equities or expired listings. You have underpriced homes for sale on the MLS. You have paid ads on Facebook. I've done this and spent plenty of money on it and locked up deals. You have the Facebook Marketplace. You have state executor slash admin. You have estate or probate attorneys. It's a very good niche list. You have, of course, the OG bandit signs. You have what we call empty nesters. They've lived in their home for more than 30 years. You have radio ads. You have building code violations. That's a good rabbit hole. You have health code violations. You have one of the greatest pain points, pre-foreclosures. You have one of my favorites, inheritance. You have double payments, people that own more than two homes and obviously paying two payments. You have transferred for work. This one you got to get a little creative to figure out how to do it. Obviously, word of mouth. Some states give you specific example of this. Medical and health problems. Again, you have to get a little creative for that one. Vacant homes. This one is great, and it's going to tie into a different one. You have bankruptcy. You have the pre foreclosure. Usually, right when they miss that first payment. That one you have to be careful with, of course. Credit repair agencies and counselors. This one could be good, of course. Those are great buyers for wraps, sub twos, hybrids, etc. VA foreclosures, same as like the pre foreclosures, but VAs. People going to prison. That one is always an interesting one. Employees that have been laid off. That was a huge one in COVID. That's when the market was wild, wild west. Networking with other investors, of course, that's a big one. Owners of Section 8 approved properties, that's a good one as well. Everybody talks crap about Section 8. I grew up in Section 8. We were one of the best, cleanest tenants because you have to get inspected very often, at least back then. And so we took care of these apartments as well as anybody else should. So don't be afraid of Section 8. Let's see, what do we have next on the list? Newspaper ads. You have properties with liens on. You have sales people and new subdivisions. So those folks knocking on your door. Hey, I have solar panels. You have mortgage brokers, you have bird dogs, you have bankruptcy court listing. That's a good one. You have CPA firms, you have real estate attorneys. You have people getting booted or repossessed. That one is a good one. Go make friends with the folks at the repo. You have carpet cleaners. That one is a good one. You have, churches and charitable groups. That one is good as well. I mean, who better than to, go straight to the source when folks are, asking God for, hey, I need help. Be that shining light. Don't abuse that one. You have county inspectors. Great one. You have large employers like Home Depot, Lowe's. You have executive property short-term transferees. You have nursing and retiring homes. That one is a good one. Just be careful you're not coming off, as a shark, so to speak. You have door hangers. You have garage sales. Good way to tell you if they're vacating a property. You have the hair salons and barbershops. You have insurance brokers. You have this is an old one, but you can post ads in Penny Saver or Penny Pincher. We have water gas companies shut off list. That one is a good one, especially like in the Midwest. Uh, you have high equity owners and you have free and clear owners. Now that was over 50 opportunities for you to find a motivated seller. I could go on and on and on and on about lists and niche lists and list stacking. And for those of you that don't understand, stacking is basically finding a pain point and stacking more on top of it, i.e., foreclosure, inheritance, no equity, so on and so on and so forth. Those are very, 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 very niche lists. And when you pull a list, it's probably not going to be anything like 1,000 leads. It's more like 50 leads, 20 leads, 10 leads. And those leads are really good leads. And so with all the ones that I called out, drop in the comment below and tell me exactly your favorite, the one that you've closed before. I've done a lot of these and I've closed leads this way. One of the other ones that I did not mention, PPC, PPL, Google ads, YouTube ads, etc. I literally gave you over 60 ways to find a motivated seller. It's up to you. Whether you win, you lose, you eat, you starve. It's all up to you. Leave a comment below. Hit that subscribe notification button as well. And I'll see you on the next one.